welcome into the Shadow Box. I am Carlise, your host. I am also your grief and trauma coach and your shadow work guide. Today with us, I have Nalda, and Nalda is the creator of the Grief Hub. And the Grief Hub is pretty much about bringing resources to those who are in the grieving community. She is currently in Croatia, so she is miles away from us. Nalda, thank you for coming into the Shadow Box and just tell us a little more about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a bereaved mom. I lost my son Josh to an overdose, a fentanyl overdose, just over 2 years ago. And I'm in Croatia, as you mentioned, and that's part of my grief journey, was leaving the United States with my husband and becoming digital nomads and traveling. And it was very much by design. We wanted, after losing our child, it felt like obviously our world was upended. And if we had this very deep sense of powerlessness, and when we decided to sell everything and just leave the States and we headed to Costa Rica initially, it was sort of like taking back some control over our lives. There was that part of it, but also kind of feeling like, hey, tomorrow is not guaranteed, right? So instead of waiting until retirement age to do the things that we really want to do, we just decided now is the time. I mean, we have another child who is an adult and lives with my husband's ex-wife. He's my stepson. And so we found ourselves as empty nesters at, like a pretty young age. And with this desire we didn't want to travel at the time. Our intention was to go to Costa Rica, and I wanted to really heal, just really feel every feeling and give myself time, without the expectation of returning to work and just jumping back into my life as though nothing had changed. Like I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
So we moved to Costa Rica. We lived there for a year, and then we just decided the hot weather, the tropical climate, is just not for us. So we moved to Europe, living in Spain initially for a few months, and then settling in Croatia. And this is not our final destination. We are, we're going to move somewhere else when our visa expires in about a year and a half.
Okay. And so now, because you've moved around, you're originally from Ecuador, but you moved to New York. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I was born in Ecuador. My entire family, I have lots and lots of relatives that I've never met. So I was born in Ecuador. And when I was a baby, really, my parents and my siblings and I and some other family members moved to the New York City area. And that is where I grew up. Yeah, in New York City.
All right. And what is your son's name?
Josh. His name is
Josh.
Josh. He died when he was 20.
Okay. So go ahead and just start walking us down. Well, actually, let's go back to your history first, because this kind of plays along the lines of things unfolding and how you kind of process your loss. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your home atmosphere.
Okay. So the immigrant experience, I believe, is very difficult. My parents had three, well, at the time, two, just my sister and I, but they had lost a child, I would say 8 years before I came along. And it devastated their lives. My father was a police officer. My mom, was a stay-at-home mom. And they lost my brother, Jackson, when he was 3 years old. It was an accidental poisoning. It happened on Christmas Day, but he died 3 days after Christmas. He just in Ecuador, Christmas and New Year's are like 4th of July here in the US, they set off fireworks, and he just like put fireworks, like some kind of firecracker or something that had, yeah, really bad. And he ingested it, and yeah, so unfortunately he didn't make it. So that put a lot of stress on my family, on my parents. And when they moved to the US, when I was a child, my father and my mom, they, they had different experiences. My mom, like, she enrolled in school, and she went to work because she had to work. I don't think she had ever even worked before. I mean, they had a little farm, but other than that, she didn't like work outside the home. And my dad, not knowing English, he wasn't able to keep his job as continue to be a police officer. So he just had various jobs, and they were like, for him, it was really like humbling to go from being a civil servant to like cleaning floors or doing whatever odd jobs came along, and not being able to speak the language. And so there was tremendous stress, right? So, and they had like my mom's siblings to support in South America. So her mom had died when she was like 15. So there was just a lot of financial stress. And part of, going to the US was trying to make enough money to send back to the family in Ecuador. So, there was financial stress. There was the stress of, acclimating to a new and adjusting to a new culture and learning a new language. So, my father at the time, he sort of like, he would binge drink. Like, he didn't drink every day, but when he drank, sometimes he overdid it. And I just remember there being a lot of stress about that. And unbeknownst to me, I had no idea, but he was also having some psychotic symptoms. He had paranoia. That he felt he was convinced that there were people like after him, that the CIA and the FBI. And so obviously that's, paranoia, but it was just, I had no idea. I do remember that we lived in a little apartment, and, my belief was, until I was an adult, that people would break in and steal our stuff every time we left. I think it actually did happen one time, but I just like kind of lived in constant fear, because I remember there being talk about neighbors watching us, and, they were out to get us. And that is what I believed. I believed that we were, that there were bad people out to get us, so that was really stressful. And, there was the typical like fighting and stuff, but there was a serious mental illness that wasn't dealt with, through doctors and medication. It wasn't managed. So he was very symptomatic. And it was, I think, part of the culture, just sort of deal with your problems on your own, keep it within the family. So,
Right.
yeah, so it was really stressful. And the way that I dealt with everything was I just withdrew into myself when I was very young. I read a lot and I wrote a lot. So I just sort of, I kind of disappeared into the world of books, and, it provided a really good and healthy escape. Right. But then when I was like in middle school, I started drinking and I tried pot, and then, I really stopped growing emotionally. It really stunted me emotionally because I started using maladaptive ways to deal with the fear and the stress of my home life, and, the fighting and all that. So, I just sort of like shut my feelings off,
Yeah.
and that continued. I got progressively worse, and I went off to college and continued drinking very, very heavily. I was a daily drinker, and I started to experience consequences that I didn't have in high school. In high school, I did bare minimum, because studying wasn't my interest. I had no ambition. I didn't want to go to college, but my family had planned other plans for me, and I went off to college because that's why we were in the U.S., right? To that American
Right.
chasing that American dream, and they wanted us to have opportunities that they didn't have. So college was definitely like non-negotiable. So, I went off to college feeling not at all prepared, not
Yeah.
academically, but emotionally, right, to handle
Right.
all of it and the
Yeah.
stress of managing my own time and all that. So, my drinking picked up. I eventually went to rehab and I got sober, thankfully, at the age of 19. And
Well, let's see. Let's go back to dad a little bit,
yeah,
because dad was displaying some symptoms of, like you said, he was having psychotic breaks. He was a police officer. Do you believe that was he already like this when he was in Ecuador, or
I,
do you believe that it some experiences that he had in Ecuador that kind of heightened him in this way?
um, from what I've gathered in my conversations with my mom and my sibling, my older sister, is that my father was experiencing those same symptoms when he was a police officer in Ecuador, and I think there was just he had he had issues dating back to his childhood, I'm sure, but I can't tell you details because people really didn't talk in my family. It was just
Right.
everything was like everyone sort of was very tight-lipped about it, so the adults only knew, children were left out. We knew nothing. I
Yeah.
honestly, to be honest, I didn't notice anything strange about my dad until I was in high school. And he started to talk to me about the people that he felt were following us, ruining his relationship with my mom, and just, some things that I thought were just like completely like I just like I didn't know where it was coming from, and it none of it made sense to me, but I had no idea what mental illness was, what it looked like, how it manifested, like at all. No clue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so with being that being the case, you didn't have an outlet. Did you have, I'm assuming that you didn't have an outlet if things were just kept, closed mouth about it. So your siblings and you guys didn't talk about what you guys were experiencing at home. You guys just kind of went through the motions.
Yeah, and each of us, had a unique way of dealing with it. Like, so the oldest sibling, my sister, is 8 years older, right? Because my
Mhm.
parents went 8 years without, trying to have another child after they lost my brother. So she is very type A, right? So she took on a lot of the responsibility that my mom couldn't handle, because my dad left for a few years. He just left and came back like years later. I would say maybe 3 years later. And in that time, my sister stepped in. She went to work at a hair salon when she was 15, and she worked really hard. And I don't know that she helped provide for us, but she certainly took on a very mothering role in our lives, right? And my brother, who came along 2 years after we were in the U.S., he was the youngest, and um, he was a good kid, but he got in trouble at school. He had learning disabilities, and it was really hard. So he was sort of the scapegoat, and then I was the lost middle child. Nobody paid attention to me, which was
Yeah.
really easy for me in that way to drink and to do all the things that I did right under my mom's nose. Like no one ever suspected that I was doing what I was doing, right? Because,
Mhm.
there was just so much going on. And unfortunately, a lot of the focus was on my brother, because he was the obvious, like, the kid that was like getting in trouble and getting suspended and doing things like that. I mean, I was a good student, without really trying hard. I didn't do anything, I didn't have to do much, and I did well in school. I flew under the radar always.
Yeah. And that, now that we're kind of, we've mentioned mom a little bit, and we know that there was a lot of grief in the home.
Yeah.
And if you're a family that's dealing with grief, but you do not properly deal with the mental health portion of it, or mental health at all, and this is a culture thing, even in the Black culture or Hispanic cultures, it's like mental health issues don't really exist. It's like, get over it, or you don't cry. You need to do something other than bringing attention to yourself, showing weakness through emotion, because the world doesn't want to see that, right? And so you have to suppress it all. So before we go into, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into mom and that mother wound that ended up coming about. What did grief look like in your home?
That's an interesting question because, yes, the family was impacted by this devastating loss. However, my mom was very open about my brother in that she loved sharing the happy memories that she had. I mean, she talked about that night, the night that he was poisoned, having to go really far to find, I think they went to a family friend who was a doctor, but they were miles from a hospital. So, that she was very open about. But, we had pictures of him on the wall. There were actually pictures of him in the casket, which I found I remember seeing those pictures, and she had a photo album, and they were right there, easily accessible. She didn't try to shield us. I'll say that.
Yeah.
You know, so there was this dichotomy of like, don't talk about your feelings outside of the family, but within the family, especially when it came to Jackson, his name was also Jackson. When it came to his death, my mom was an open book. My father, on the other hand, never mentioned him, right? He did not talk about, I don't remember him once talking about Jackson. But my mom loved sharing stories. And I think that has helped me tremendously. It's had a really positive impact in how I deal with my grief. But going back to the mother wound, I know we talked about that, you and I, a while ago. And I have a love-hate relationship with that term. I find it, on the one hand, really, I don't know, harsh and critical, because it implies that, or suggests, lack of nurturing and emotional support on the part of the mom. And to an extent, sure, yeah, there was, because my mom was focused on the sick person in the home, which was my dad, right? So when he drank too much, or when he was very ill with his mental illness, the focus was on my dad. There were financial struggles, especially when he left, right? So she was suddenly dealing with being a single mom. For all intents and purposes, she was, for, the 3 years that he was gone. So what that did was basically her preoccupation with controlling my dad, or attending to his needs, or kind of anticipating, his moods and all, it took away from her attention towards me and my siblings. Right. So I feel that just led to me internalizing and blaming myself for their problems, right? Their adult problems. I felt like I started to, I feel that I then was preoccupied with my mom's every mood, every minute of the day. I never, I would watch her, and I would try to anticipate her needs. And that level of focus on something external, like a person and their behavior, and watching their every move, and it kept me from really nurturing myself. right? From
Yeah.
really taking
Because you
care
were in a fight or
of my.
flight all the time.
I was always in fight or flight, or I was
Mm,
like, trying to figure out like how can I help my mom? Not that I was aware of it at the time, but there was sort of like a role reversal in like me trying to take care of my mom emotionally, not financially, obviously, but emotionally. And
mm,
so, you know, there was a lot of trauma, that generational trauma. There is alcoholism, like on both sides of my mom's side and my dad's side. And I think that unwittingly, my mom passed down, and my dad, that generational trauma,
yeah.
but my gripe with the term mother wound, I don't know, it feels like blaming. And now that I have lost a child who also
Hmm.
dealt with addiction and mental illness, like when I hear the mother wound, I feel like it was something that I did out of neglect or out of, just not caring for my son, when I loved him so much and I did the best that I could, and I gave him all resources or connected him to all the resources that he needed. But I don't know if I'm making sense, but basically,
No, yeah, you're making total sense, and I understand the kind of the love and hate relationship that you would have with with the word mother wound. Um, and the way that I interpret the mother wound is, a wound um, comes from an actual, let's see, an entity that has caused a fracture, or an entity that has caused a cut, or an entity that has caused an infection, right? And so the outside entity of it is, not being paid attention to, not being nurtured in a way. And the reason I think that we have so many issues with that term is because it is our parents. We don't want to have anyone to look down on them, or to not acknowledge the love that they did give us, to whatever level that they can give it to us, right? But it doesn't mean that the way that they treated us, or the way that they raised us, or the conditioning that was around it and the atmosphere didn't affect us. So the effect of whatever was going on caused a wound. And when you cause a wound to someone, what are we doing? We're trying to figure out how to fix it, how to heal it, how to overcome it. And then we start finding little areas in there where we're trying to cope. So people go coping with sex, they go coping with these relationships that they're trying to find love in all the wrong places. In your case, you try to cope with it with alcohol, all of these things. And it's because we're trying to heal what was our infection by what we did not receive in the home from either the mother or the father, right?
correct. Yeah.
And so, and then on the other end of the spectrum too, for you, it's like you turn that blame internal for your baby, because you're like, well, what didn't I do for him? What wound did I cause for him? And the reality is that I'm a mother too. The reality is that some of our decisions, some of our reactions, some of our, whatever we've done as parents to think that we're trying to better ourselves, or better our children, or better the atmosphere, we do end up causing some wounds in our children, because we don't know any better sometimes. And so while fixing ourselves and trying to fix our lives, yeah, we make some scrapes and bruises for our kids sometimes. And that's hard as parents to grapple with, because it's like, but all I've done for you, right? I've everything I've sacrificed for you, and you can't. But when we stop and think about it objectively, and think about it in a way of us being a child at one point in time, us being conditioned in our atmospheres at one point in time, we do step back and say, huh, yeah, I probably did inflict a little pain there, or inflict a little wound there. So I totally get why it's almost like a hard pill to swallow when you don't want to, when it's hard to accept that part, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And all I did, in early grief was examine my every decision I made, in Josh's life, every mistake I made. It was, it was like a reel in my brain, and it just was on a loop, right? Like every, you know, anytime I lost my patience or I lost my temper or I lost, like every mistake I made as a mom, I'm like, yeah, I really blamed myself. And when I would, hear like about the mother wound, it no longer applied to my mom. Because when it applied to my mom, I'm like, yeah, yeah, that's what she did, But when it
Really?
applied to me, I was like,
Yeah.
no, I didn't want to accept that I had unwittingly and
Mhm.
unintentionally, caused my son pain. But it's in therapy I saw a very, very wonderful therapist, trained in, and she was very in trauma, and she was
Mhm.
obviously very trauma informed. And basically she really helped me to find compassion for myself and forgiveness, because the decisions that I made, right, I obviously can't go back and change, right? But also I made because of certain beliefs or certain, you know, um, ways of thinking that were instilled in me from a very young age, right? And
It's
given
survival.
it's survival, right? So, I could, because I was in, I was, when I was married to Josh's dad, there was a lot of the same sort of trying to fix my ex-husband, trying to control, he was a drinker too. Just like, it was like a relationship that, not in every way, but in some ways, sort of were similar to what I saw growing up.
Yeah.
It was the same type of thing. And so my preoccupation with my spouse at the time really gave Josh that feeling that he didn't matter, right? Because my focus was on my husband at the time, and my mood was up and down, because when my husband was doing, well, quote unquote, well, then I was happy. And when his mental health was, really like causing a lot of chaos in the family, then, so it was a lot of, my son internalized all of it, and he felt like, and ultimately when we divorced, he felt like it was his fault, right? As much as we went to therapy and we had these long talks, and I tried to really help him understand that it had nothing to do with him. It was, it was too late. That wound was there. And,
Yeah.
but I did not cause his mental illness. Mental illness, unfortunately, runs in my family. So if it wasn't the divorce or, you know, whatever that I did, or didn't do, or didn't provide enough of, I don't think any of that, triggered or led to his mental illness. It would have been a breakup with a girlfriend, or, what actually led to the onset of his illness was simply graduating from high school. And just that life transition, it was stress. It was stressful for him to think, oh, I'm leaving my family, I'm leaving my mom, and I'm going, like, even though he eventually decided to take a gap year, I never put pressure on him to, to live outside the home, to go to any particular school, to, I gave him the, the decision making, um, the responsibility of making decisions for his own life, right?
Yeah, just holding him accountable
Yeah,
at some point
right.
for his own decisions. And we have to think about mental illness as well as something that we can be predispositioned for, right?
Sure.
And so when we're talking about your father having the mental illness, and then we don't know what his father had or his family had,
Right.
it goes so far down the line where it comes back up again, and DNA is just not one of those things that, oh, I look like my mom, or I look like my father, or I act like this, that, and the other. it's generational. We have this makeup in us that remembers things from so far behind, so far beyond from what we've been born into, and so when we think about that, we have to think about the generations that were before us, that what was their lives about, what sort of trauma and what sort of scarcity did they come from, where this is now what is a part of us for our survival.
Mhm.
Did they come, did your father's parents come from, places where people really were after them, where they really had to be hyper vigilant about the things that were around them? Did it trigger and change a mechanism in there where it's like, okay, this is being passed down because we're fearful, we don't know what to do, but let's figure it out. Let's figure out how to survive. That travels down generations, and so I would say that, those who do have mental illnesses, I think that it's some of them, yes, may develop as things change, as they grow up or what have you. But I think a lot of them, it does come down the generational line. And that's where it's like you could give yourself grace, like you have. Like, I know that I didn't necessarily cause this. Now were there some triggers in there that kind of brought it out and that just kind of, inflated it? Like you said, girlfriend, school, all of the things. Maybe so. Some things lay dormant, and it takes one little button that's pushed and everything just blows up, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And it was just, it was at exactly the time when these symptoms begin, which is around the age of 17 to 20, or maybe a little older than that. Yeah, he was an amazing student. He graduated early. He was only 16 when he graduated, a little, say 16 and a half when he graduated high school. He took advanced placement classes. He had a business. He did, he was a videographer. He taught himself, you know um, video editing, and had a business making music videos for the local artists in our community. And yeah, eventually he did get accepted into a program in California. And that was a very pivotal time in his life.
Yeah,
But had he
yeah,
gone,
and
to college, down the street from me, I believe that his fate was, it wouldn't have changed, because he was
yeah.
grappling with a very serious mental illness. And yeah, so it was like a,
Now, was he diagnosed and being treated for it, or were we just kind of figuring that he had a mental illness?
yeah, so he started showing signs that he was not well when he was 17. Um, And what that looked like was basically just poor executive functioning. Like, he had this business, he was no longer in high school, and he had all this time on his hands. And he either worked really, so he was hyper focused on, editing the videos that he made or out filming, or he just really couldn't stay organized. He did have ADHD, and I believe that that was a precursor to the bipolar or schizoaffective disorder. I mean, we never did get a clear diagnosis, but it was a thought disorder. Some called it a thought disorder. Others, other doctors and psychiatrists said it was bipolar disorder or schizoaffective disorder. But basically, it was a combination of a mood disorder and, psychosis, right? So,
Okay.
like, when I say a mood disorder, like, he had highs and lows. But what I saw,
Yeah.
we never saw any highs, any manic behavior. What we saw was just inability, a lot of cognitive decline. So simple tasks, I noticed, were suddenly like really difficult for him. Right. So when he was applying for college, like writing the essay, and I mean, he was such a great student, right? And suddenly he couldn't write an essay, he couldn't concentrate. And I figured it was because he had decided to stop taking his medication for ADHD. And
Okay.
so very lovingly, suggested that maybe he might go back on the medication, because what I saw was disorganized thinking, um, um, inability to get basic tasks done. The way that he interacted with us, just in basic communication skills, he was at one point, I mean, most all his life, he was such a talker. He communicated beautifully, right? But he was just having a hard time just expressing himself, just, in general, like, conversations. And
Yeah.
his thoughts really, like, I couldn't follow it. They were not very logical. They I had a hard time following his train of thought, because he was
Okay.
just here, there, and everywhere. He would start talking about one thing and then jump to something else and something else, and I couldn't make sense of what he was saying. So we were terrified. We had no idea what was going on. He lost a lot of weight. He got really preoccupied with religion. He would like sit with a Bible and just read it obsessively. I mean, we we were not religious. We went to church, but so I found that as being out of character. And if it wasn't religion, then he got really into crystals, and he was talking about like spirituality, and you know um, just things that he normally didn't talk about, right? And he basically, his behavior was so odd to his friends that it alienated him from the people that were in his life. Like, his friends just started backing off, backing away, and he just, was very isolated, and lost a ton of weight because he was fasting for religious reasons, he said. And we were trying so hard to, to get him the help that he needed. And he saw many different psychiatrists and therapists, but what ended up happening was, about 6 months before he turned 18, he had a catatonic depressive episode. It was the first one. And he was unresponsive. Like, he just kind of blinked or had his eyes closed, and he wouldn't move. He was stiff as a board, and there was just no communication there, no ability to communicate. So he was hospitalized for the first time. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning. After that, then, then the psychosis became very apparent, because when he started talking, I guess I gave him enough medication to sort of calm his anxiety, because it was really
Mhm.
high anxiety that he was, experiencing. Then when he did start communicating, nothing made sense. It was just,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it was really difficult. It was really difficult because basically we all experienced, it was a lot of grief over the future that we thought like he wasn't going to be able to have, because we didn't know, you know, how things were going to unfold. Would he make it to college? Would he be able to work, have his little business and be as productive as he had always been? Because
Yeah.
that started a series of hospitalizations. It was in and out and going from one psychiatrist to another, trying to get a diagnosis and the right medication, which was really hard. A lot of times he was
Yeah.
over medicated, and yeah, it did clear up his mind, right? And he was no longer psychotic, but he also was unable to communicate with us because he had so much medication in him, and it just
Yeah.
sort of changed his affect, right? He had a very flat affect, um,
Mhm.
and he just wasn't the vibrant, happy-go-lucky kid that I knew. It was like he just changed.
Yeah.
It was like I lost him before he actually died, and
Mhm.
there was just a lot of grief over that.
Yeah. And it's like, as I'm sitting here listening to you, it seems like he went into a state of really trying to figure himself out and really trying to find himself.
Hmm.
Somewhere within himself, he was lost. And how
Right.
many of us, all of us, right, have gone through those motions of whether if it's in our teenage years, after, turning 21, or just trying to find ourselves because of the conditioning that we've been around, because of the atmosphere, the social aspects of everything. And we go through a part of really who are we? And we go through these little different phases that people used to call them, right? Oh, she's hanging with the goth people. She's over there doing, she's smoking cigarettes, or she's, all these different, she's a cheerleader now. All these different phases that normally teenagers do go through. They may not be to the extreme of drugs or whatever. I'm just saying, but all these phases. And sometimes I think that these phases, they get caught in something. And when they get caught in something, then that's where that I don't fit in here. I don't, my parents are having issues there. Is it my fault? My friends, my social group is changing, and it seems like it just gets stuck somewhere. And that's what it kind of sounds like it did for him, outside of already having the predisposal to the mental illness that grandfather had. I think somewhere in there it got stuck. And when they go into these catatonic phases that you just mentioned, this is where neuroscience and the study of everything really comes into play. Because I wonder if they would have did like what's called an fMRI, which is it's functional. It's going to tell you, like, it's going to show you these circuits. Where did it stop at? And why did it stop right there for him to really just kind of flicker out? Right. And I think that instead of a lot of, um, I don't know, psychiatrists and even psychologists, in a sense of being so psychoanalytical about it, let's figure out what the mechanics are about it, right? So that we can properly help them, to get out of this phase, instead of just giving them medication and hoping that it works, right?
Sure.
So I can go down the whole trajectory about that, but it just sounds like sometimes people are caught up in this matrix where if we have the right education and utilize the tools correctly, we might be able to pull them out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And we were hoping that would be the case. And the only time he sort of came back to us, meaning he was the Josh that we knew,
Mm-hmm.
was when he would get off the medication,
Mm-hmm.
because he turned 18, and that was not easy, because at that point I could no longer hospitalize him, or get him, force him to take medication, or that all ended. So basically it was up to him. And you know he didn't like the way the medication made him feel.
Yeah.
And he would just abruptly get off the medications. And I know for a fact that that's what led to his overdose. I mean, he felt hopeless. He felt like his life was never going to look different. He had periods where he was very successful, and he was very high functioning, even with the mental illness, but those were periods that were short lived, because ultimately he would decompensate. He would end up, in a hospital, because his symptoms were just, unmanageable, and his life would become unmanageable. So, it was devastating, for us, but it was mostly devastating to him, because
Yeah.
of what it did to his mind, what it did to his life, his social life, his work life, his education or lack thereof. Because he really wasn't, cognitively not able to handle any kind of course load. So
Yeah. And for him, I imagine that that was very difficult, especially when you know that you're so intelligent and so smart. Like, he
yeah,
was in the AP classes. He was in, he
yeah.
finished at 16 and a half. Like, it's like that slow decline, or that I know it's in there, but I can't pull it out. That had to be suffocating for him. extremely
And his inability to communicate, his inability,
yeah.
like he was no longer that funny kid that made people laugh, that witty, like quick-witted,
Mhm.
kid that he always had been. And he sort of like, when he was heavily medicated, which was after a hospital stay, which lasted anywhere from like 2 weeks to a month. He would come
Yeah.
out heavily medicated, and he was just sort of like, he would just shuffle around, and he was just so flat, right?
Yeah.
And it was devastating, and I knew that there had to be medication out there that didn't have those devastating side effects, and he did, for a while, um, have injections of a medication that wasn't as strong as what they would inject him with in the hospital. And I was really like a very strong advocate for him. Like, I was always like on the phone with the doctors. If I couldn't get out to California, which is where he was living, like I would just drop everything and fly out there, because he went out there
Yeah.
for treatment, you know but I was very involved in his treatment, and I he would give me permission to talk to his doctors, thankfully. And I made sure that they didn't give him certain medications, and that they did give him others that I had researched had fewer side effects. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so there was one medication that he was on that did manage his symptoms and allowed him to, to be pretty functional, but how he felt was a different story. And
Yeah.
he just had this, um, apathy, a chronic apathy, when he was on the medication, that, I mean, it was just awful for him, like nothing made him happy. Like, it just didn't matter what he did. Like, he just had this, like, um high level, like, depression, or apathy. They call it apathy.
Yeah.
And that's because of his mental illness. That was a characteristic or a symptom of his mental illness, but it also, was worsened by the medication, right? So his
Yeah.
only reprieve, right, was getting off the meds, because it did help him feel more like himself, but it was a double-edged sword, because
Right.
he would start becoming symptomatic in a matter of months. Plus, when anyone gets off a medication, especially like an antipsychotic, abruptly, that causes a side effect, is suicidal behavior, right? And thinking. And yeah, so he became very suicidal, extraordinarily and dangerously depressed. And that's where
Yeah.
he was when he went out, and it wasn't an accidental overdose. We know that it wasn't. He pretty much, ended he just wanted out. He wanted the suffering to end, right? So
Yeah.
he went out, and he found the fentanyl, and he got the fentanyl. So,
Yeah. Now, as you were, and I know that's a lot, and we get so used to telling our story that it can be on auto for us, you know. And when we start getting into this part of the ending of him, I know that that's a lot now. And it's heavy, but it gets easier to kind of talk about without sitting in the feeling of it, right? And so sometimes, especially when we've had to adopt such a strength, when we've had to adopt such a of I know I can't go down this road because it is too painful, it's too much, so I can talk about it, and I can shoot it off, and okay, done, got that part over with, right?
mhm.
What I want to know is, as you were watching your son go through all of this, you are a recovering addict, alcoholic. You pulled yourself out, and pretty early too, because you did this in college. And so you didn't go into like your 30s and 40s being an alcoholic. You kind of got it together pretty quick. And so as you were recovering and you were trying to still come out of your mental space of what even took you there, you're
Mhm.
seeing your son go through his experience. How were you and how did you process and handle that? How did you do that?
With a lot of support. I didn't do it
Yeah.
alone. So, I attend meetings still, even though it's been 36 years. I still, I have my AA community, which, plays a big role in my mental stability and,
Mhm.
but also I attended Al-Anon and NAMI. I don't know. Are you aware of the National Alliance for Mental Illness? NAMI. That's the acronym.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, NAMI. So I attended NAMI meetings, and they provide a lot of wonderful resources for families who are dealing with a loved one with mental illness. So I highly recommend NAMI for anyone who's dealing with what we dealt with. But Al-Anon really helped me a lot because I had to let go to an extent, right? Because he was an adult and I could not force medication on him. I mean, we did explore, and we were on, like in the process of applying for a conservatorship where basically he would lose his rights as an adult, right? Because
Mm.
I felt like for his own good, right, that I would have to do that so that we could get him into a long-term hospital, program, and keep him safe. But I feel like that just wasn't meant to be, and I don't know that that is the best option, because basically you're taking away someone's rights, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, that was sort of a last resort type of um, option for us. But we were in the process of talking to lawyers because I mean, he did not, he wouldn't stay in the hospital. He was committed a few times, and and then as soon as the meds kicked in and he started, sort of presenting like he was well or well enough
Mhm.
to not be hospitalized, he would leave and get off his meds immediately, right? And so
Yeah.
it was just like a hamster wheel that we were so exhausted, and we were grappling, we were trying to gain some kind of control, right, that we didn't have. And ultimately he just, he took his life because, and
Right.
it's like, I had to let go completely because either, there was just nothing that I could do to help my son. And it was just absolutely the most powerless that I have ever felt in my life. But I didn't do it alone because on my own, I don't have that kind of strength, right?
Right.
When I connect to a community of people that are sort of walking the same path, right? And could guide me. That's what I did. Like when I can do that, when I can tap into that source, then it relieves the burden that I felt, right? So
Yeah.
it wasn't easy. It was just the really literally the worst time in my life, um,
Yeah.
because what mother wants to see their child just
Suffering.
suffering? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk. Let's go ahead and get into Josh's kind of final days leading up to, and then his final day.
Well, he had successfully actually completed a program, a 30-day program, and in California, he the medication that he was on was like, was the perfect amount of medication, the right type. He really came back to me, and I'm ever so grateful that I had that month where we bonded again the way that we bonded all the way up until he got sick, right? Because we were very, very, very close. And he really opened up to me, and he was very self reflective. And we just, he really was just trying to process, all of the things that had occurred that led to that last hospitalization. And he was just so honest and so open, and it was a beautiful, beautiful experience. And that's something that I really try to focus on, when I'm really struggling in my grief, is our closeness and the relationship that we had, and that level of trust that he had in me, because I was there. I was his rock. I was there throughout it all. And I didn't judge, and I didn't, I just, whatever he needed, I provided as much as I could. And, when, just like, so basically, I don't know, he had been released from the hospital, and it was sort of like a step down situation where he was going to go from a 30-day inpatient to a partial PHP program, a partial hospitalization. And he abruptly decided to not attend the program that was suggested for him, and instead went to a different program closer to his apartment. And I was very stressed about that. And it was a really scary thing for me, because I knew that being around the same people, places, and things that he had been around before going into treatment was really not good for him. But again, I had no control over his actions. I could suggest things, I could say, I'm really afraid for you right now, etc. But I couldn't control, any of his. I couldn't. I could support, and I could let him know that I was there for him 100%, no matter what he did, which I said. I was very clear, and he went to a different program, and he was doing great up all the way up until literally the day that he overdosed. The night before, people saw him, and they said he was doing great, and it was like a snap. It was like something that just, they say that when people overdose or die by suicide in any way, it's sort of like a split second decision. It's just like it just happens so fast sometimes, right? I believe that I don't know, he just became overwhelmed with hopelessness, and he just didn't see a way out of his situation, or if he didn't believe that things were ever going to change for him. So, yeah. And what can I say? It was just absolutely devastating. It's devastating.
And he overdosed with fentanyl.
Yeah.
And was he at home? Was he with friends or?
No. He disappeared like 12 days before he was found. He left the residence, he was living in a home, with counselors and people. I mean, he had all the support in place. He had therapists, he had a psychiatrist, he was living in a home with counselors, it was a protected environment. And yet he just didn't show up one night. And that was on March 8th. And he bought the fentanyl the next day, took it, and he died on the 9th. But we had, he wasn't found for another 10 days. He went missing. Like, we had no idea where he was. So I don't wish that kind of pain on anyone, to not know where your child is, and the police were not interested in helping us. Basically, they knew that he he did drugs, and he had a mental illness, and basically they just assumed that he didn't want to be found. And he was an adult. We were told many times,
Yeah.
he's an adult. There's nothing you can do. When he wants to come home, he'll show up. And it was, I knew in my gut that there was something seriously wrong, but I did hold out hope. I was shocked when I got that call. I just, I got angry. I couldn't cry for a while, because I was just furious. We did hire a detective to look for him, and
Hmm.
but that was like it didn't matter. I mean, even if we had hired a person, 3 days after he went missing, he was already gone, but we didn't know that. He yeah. So yeah, and we had COVID, my whole the family, so I couldn't go out to California. It was just like this, like there was just really nothing. It made there was just nothing I could have done differently. I couldn't fly out there. I couldn't do anything. All we could do is hire someone to help look for him, right? So, um,
Right.
I did a lot of
Yeah.
praying, and I gave him to God, basically. And I asked for strength, and to accept whatever happened. And what happened was the absolute worst case scenario that I had feared,
Yeah.
happen, but never at the same time, didn't expect, you know.
Right. And why not even I guess as parents we can say why would we, right? Because that's the furthest thing that you would
Yeah.
want, the furthest thing that you would want to ever be a reality.
Hmm.
Um, what would you say that how did your grieving differ from the grieving that you've seen in your household growing up?
The way that I grieve since my loss, the way that I
Hmm.
grieve is in the open, like publicly. I'm really open about my
Okay.
grief. I wasn't in the first few months. I actually got off of social media. I didn't want to make an announcement that we had lost him. I didn't want people asking questions. I didn't want people saying that they were sorry for my loss. I didn't want any of that. I just didn't want it to be real. So it took me a while, and I remember when I first started posting, I felt very vulnerable, and I felt it was really uncomfortable for me to talk about um, Josh, his struggles, or my loss and my feelings. On even though I had no one but family and a few friends, were following me at the time, but I just felt very exposed. But over time, I started meeting more and more moms like me, and I
Hmm.
felt I gained strength from the connections that I was making, from through those connections, and friendships that eventually developed. And I got bolder and bolder and more open, and I thought, okay, this can actually make a difference, right? The more
Yeah.
transparent, the more honest I am, the more I can do to sort of normalize grief, but also combat the stigma around mental health
Yeah.
issues. So
Yeah. And do you see a difference between yourself and your mom as to how you grieved?
yes, because other than talking to me and my siblings and some family members, it was not talked about outside of my home at all. There was never any discussion outside of the home. So yeah, I mean, I'm very open, and I yeah, I'm not shy about talking about it.
Yeah. Okay. It's why you said that you're very public about it, and so that definitely is the difference. And it's kind of like you shattered that cultural norm that you grew up to
Mhm.
believe was the way, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
When we think about the way, and we think about your conditioning and just going through this whole journey that you've been through, Losing Josh, what did that expose out of you? What did that expose in you?
Um, I think it exposed feelings of inadequacy as a mom, you know, which was those feelings were very hard to deal with, because I analyzed every decision I made as a mom, right, and criticized myself for doing this instead of that, or and yeah, so that was difficult. But I also I think it really kind of exposed a sense of like I don't know how to call it, but maybe codependency. That I realized that I was only happy when he was doing well, and that when he wasn't doing well, then I felt extraordinarily depressed, and it was like these highs and lows that were very much connected to my son, right? And after he was gone, all I felt was low, and I felt like there was no coming out of this, the depths of despair that I experienced. I There was nothing anymore, there was like no purpose in my life, because my life for so long was managing my son's condition, his mental health, his helping him sort of navigate through the mental health system. And it was like, who am I now that I'm not
Yeah.
his mom? I mean, I'm always going to be his mom, but I didn't have that role,
Hmm.
right? I wasn't his
Yeah.
advocate. I wasn't his confidant
Yeah.
anymore. I wasn't, it was like, what do I do? What do I do? Where do I put my energy? Right. So it
Yeah.
was sort of like this loss of identity that I suffered. Like, it just
Yeah.
crushed it, just smashed it to smithereens. But I realized that I have to find out who I am, outside of this relationship with my child. Right. And,
Yeah.
when I say codependency, I don't mean it in a negative way. It's just, it was negative for me, in that, my sense of well-being and my happiness was very much tied to my child, right?
Yeah.
I have to, what I've learned is that happiness has to come from a different source. It could never be attached to another human being. That's not, that,
Yeah.
that's that, and today, like, I have a very healthy, marriage. I love my husband, but he does not, um, fulfill me in every way. He doesn't meet every emotional need. He's very supportive, right? But,
Mhm.
I have to find happiness within myself and not attach it to another person. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that I learned from Al Anon.
Yeah, and that's why I asked this question, and I love the way that you answered it, because it is exactly the way that it plays out in my head. And I asked a question about exposure because what you just described was the unconditioning of the conditioning, right? Because when you were, and this is where we go into that shadow work, into that shadow part of you. When you were a child, you had to manage your mother's emotions. You managed the atmosphere of your father. You
Yeah.
managed all of these things.
Right.
And so you managed your husband when you were in that marriage with
Mhm.
him. And then you
It's my
managed
son.
your son when you were. So that's where all of that codependency came into, because
Absolutely.
that is what your life was made out of. You were used
Exactly.
to managing people,
Exactly. So when my
And so,
child
yeah,
was gone, it was like, well, who do I manage? Because
yeah,
luckily I'm with a man, a wonderful husband who is a grown up and doesn't need to be managed, right? He makes
yeah,
decisions. So I can't obsess over that relationship because it's healthy, thank goodness, and this is the result
yeah.
of all the work I've done, right? In therapy and in AA and Al-Anon, etc. So, yeah, so it's like, where's that energy go? Where's that, like, who can I help? Who
Yeah.
can I fix?
And it goes into you. Yeah, it goes, the energy, it goes into you so it can expose you to who you really are,
Exactly.
because all of those things that you were that you had on your shoulders, that you were conditioned to believe and to manage and to, I mean, who wouldn't there's, like I said before, there's a lot of addictions that people come into and having, but when you are used to managing people and especially people's emotions, like that is detrimental sometimes, especially when you don't know the temperature in the home or the temperature with that person. That is a lot and it keeps you in flight, fight or flight. So why wouldn't you go to alcohol, which will numb you up, which will make you free, right? I mean, alcohol makes you free. So it makes you free and you don't have to manage anyone. And overall, I don't have to manage myself
Exactly.
because my blood alcohol level is real thin and I don't have any,
Yeah.
so you go through that, just trying to cope with what you are experiencing. And you did that, it's amazing that you didn't go back into the coping mechanism of alcohol or any other addiction as you were managing your son because that was familiar. So that just shows a lot of strength and a lot of resiliency that you had to display for yourself of eventually coming down the line of choosing yourself, eventually coming down the line of exposing yourself to your truth, of to opening your eyes up to the pattern of, oh, I have been groomed to manage people. Now all I have to do is really manage myself,
Yeah.
and I don't even know how to. I'm now I don't have any other projects, right? To put it in a different term. So now the project is me,
Mhm.
and that's where it could get a little scary because you're meeting a part of you that you've never known. But it also shows you that strength that you have because you're like, dang, I've been here all this time. How much time of my life did I and you don't want to say necessarily waste, but a lot of time went by that I was really just succumbed by other people's toxicity, other people's heaviness. And now here I am with the light and the lightness, and I'm trying to get to know myself. Like that, I mean, it's just crazy how loss will really expose you and unfold you.
Yeah, I just want to go back real quick to when he was very sick. Those years, it was 3 years. I really turned to my AA community, right? To the sponsor that
Mm-hmm.
I had, to helping other women. Kind of being there for other women, kind of getting out of myself. Not staying, not feeling like I had to figure it out. Right? It was a lot of like letting go, trusting God, helping others. Right? That's how I live my life now.
Mm-hmm.
um what you just said, what was that last thing that you just said? Oh yeah, I mean, grief will break you open. It really, it shatters you, but it's almost a beautiful thing, right? Because in that
Yeah.
breaking, right, there's the if you don't turn to alcohol, drugs, and maladaptive behaviors, which I choose not to, right? um, I'm,
Yeah.
I'm faced with sitting with myself, sitting with those emotions, sifting through the rubble, really, because my life exploded, right? So it's like all these pieces,
Right.
and it's like, oh gosh, like he's not here for me to manage, like you said. And then it was like, okay, the period of reconstruction then began, right? So, and I
Yeah.
knew that if I had gone back to work, gone back to my life, that I wouldn't have time or energy to really focus on that reconstruction period. I felt that I needed to go away and just
Yeah.
sort of give myself the time to rebuild myself, to figure out who I was
Yeah.
outside of this relationship, outside of my role as a mother. And
Yeah.
today I still feel very connected to Josh, right? And I'm still his mom, and I still have a relationship with him through letters that I write and through the signs that he sends me. So, you know, I miss having him in the physical form, but that relationship continues. And I, grief, like they say, grief is love, right? And they say like grief is love without any
Right.
go. No, it's that love is there, and now it sort of goes, first I gave it to myself, and now because of the strength that I gained from that and the fact that I now know who I am, it's a completely different sort of sense of who I am that I now have, right? Um, I give that love out to people, right? And I love
Yeah.
helping others. You know, it's not about fixing, it's not about controlling or any of that, and trying to manage people's grief, you know, in any way. It's just, you know, quietly, you know, providing the resources, helping them get connected, just, you know, just uh, through the work that I do, and coming here and telling my story as authentically and honestly as I can, right? In hope that someone will listen, watch, and you know, get something from my experience. And that's just, you know, the way I live my life now. It's all about just really being of service to other grieving moms, or just anyone who has experienced loss. So
Yeah. So now that you've made a lot of good points there, and it brings me to the question of, now that you've come through and you've had some time to process, I want to ask you, who are you, Nalda?
hmm I feel that I'm a woman with a very deep level of compassion and empathy for people who suffer. Very deep, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so, do you have any projects or any goals or anything that's coming down the pipeline that we should keep an eye out on?
Um, so I've been writing. I've been doing a lot of. I have not been doing a whole lot of writing, not as much as I did in that first year, but I have a Substack, and I'm starting a weekly series called Let's Talk About Death, where I interview people who have experienced loss or who work in the field of death and dying, like thanatologists,
Mhm.
funeral directors, death doulas, you know, and just really open the conversation um, for understanding why society, you know, considers death and grief such a taboo subject, you know, in an effort to normalize uh, grief and death, and have real conversations and help people understand, you know, a little bit more about what we experience, you know, in
Yeah.
as people who have had traumatic loss.
Awesome. Okay, so every the ways to get in touch with Nalda and to get within her the program that she's creating will be up under her bio under the podcast. So we will definitely have that information for you guys. Nalda, I want to thank you for coming into the shadow box and trusting the space, trusting me with that information, and just really processing your life with me, right? Because even though we go through this journey of loss, it brings out a part of us that we neglect ourselves, right?
Mhm.
And so when we get to know ourselves, then that's the way that we are better of service to those who cross our path, which is exactly what you are, you know, taking yourself into with everything that you're doing, providing the resources and providing the talks that you're about to do. So I just want to thank you for really just coming in and going through this process with me.
Well, it was an honor to be here. Really, thank you for having me. It was really nice talking to you.
Awesome. Everyone else, thank you for coming into the shadow box.